The moment that young fellow laughed and said the bridge outside Cody should have been torn down 20 years ago, something inside my chest folded in on itself like old timber giving way under too much snow. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not exactly. More the kind a man gives when he's certain he understands the world better than the folks who came before him. Still, it landed hard. I remember the room clearly. Funny how memory works when it decides something matters. Every small detail settles in like dust in a quiet house. The Cody Town Hall wasn't much to look at. Just a square building with weathered siding and a flagpole that squeaked when the wind pushed it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and that dry Wyoming dust folks track in on their boots no matter how hard they stomp the mats outside. Rows of folding metal chairs had been set up facing a long table where the council sat. The legs of those chairs scraped and clicked whenever someone shifted, and every little sound carried through the room because the ceiling was higher than it needed to be. I had taken a seat in the back row. Old habit. When you reach a certain age, you start sitting where you won't be in anyone's way. My boots were dusty from the drive-in, and I kept my hat resting on my knee, slowly turning the brim between my fingers while the meeting went on. Outside, I could hear trucks rolling along the highway. Just a low steady hum every few minutes as they passed the edge of town. The evening wind was picking up too. You could hear it brushing the grass along the road and rattling the loose metal vent on the side of the building. Inside, people talked. Some of them I recognized. Most of them I didn't. Cody had grown over the years. Houses spreading out farther than they used to. New businesses along the highway. Folks coming in from other places with plans and degrees and laptops they set on the council table. The bridge had come up early in the meeting. It sat just outside town where the narrow river bends between two low banks. Nothing grand about it. Just a wooden span with thick beams and railings that had faded gray under decades of sun. I'd driven across it more times than I could count. So had everyone else. One of the visiting planners stood up first. Young man in a clean button shirt, sleeves rolled neat at the forearms. He had a stack of papers and a little projector humming on the table beside him. He talked about infrastructure. About safety standards. About modernization. He showed photographs of the bridge taken from different angles. Close-ups of the beams. Measurements scribbled on diagrams. Charts about load limits and projected growth for the town. All very organized. All very confident. He pointed to a slide where the bridge looked smaller than it ever had in real life. Frankly, he said, tapping the screen with a little metal pointer, it's surprising this structure has lasted as long as it has. A few people nodded. Someone shifted in their chair. The planner continued. He talked about engineered steel replacements, wider lanes, guardrails that met current regulations. It all sounded reasonable enough. Then a younger man 2 rows ahead of me leaned back in his chair and said something to the fellow beside him. I didn't catch the first words. But then he chuckled and said, louder this time, whoever built that thing sure didn't know much about real engineering. A few people laughed softly. Not mean. Just easy laughter. The kind people share when the past feels distant and harmless. My hand stopped turning the brim of my hat. For a moment I studied the back of that young man's head. He couldn't have been more than 30. Broad shoulders. Clean haircut. New boots that hadn't yet picked up the permanent dust most Wyoming boots carry. I wondered if he'd ever stood in that river when the snowmelt ran high and cold enough to numb your legs in seconds. I wondered if he'd ever hauled green timber through mud thick enough to swallow a truck tire. Probably not. But that wasn't his fault. The planner moved to the next slide. From a structural standpoint, he said, the bridge appears to have been constructed without formal engineering oversight. Another chuckle somewhere in the room. I kept quiet. At my age you learn something important. Not every moment belongs to you. Sometimes the younger voices need to run their course. So I sat there listening while they discussed replacement timelines and funding options. The council members asked questions. One woman near the front scribbled notes on a yellow pad. A man near the aisle kept clearing his throat every time someone mentioned taxes. The projector clicked through image after image. And all the while that bridge sat in my mind exactly as it had looked the first day we set the beams across the river. That had been nearly 40 years earlier. Back then Cody was smaller. Quieter. The road out that way wasn't paved yet. Just packed dirt that turned to deep ruts after a storm. The old crossing had washed out during a bad spring flood. Took half the bank with it. For weeks folks had to drive miles around to get cattle across or reach the highway. No contractors came. No engineers. Just neighbors. But I didn't think about that part too much as the meeting went on. I just listened. Eventually the planner finished his presentation. The room shifted into that restless quiet that comes when people are deciding whether they've heard enough. One of the councilmen leaned forward and rubbed his chin. "Well," he said slowly, "seems pretty clear the bridge has reached the end of its life." A few murmurs. Another council member flipped through some papers. "Do we know exactly how it was built?" she asked. "Any records?" Someone shook their head. "Nothing official," the planner replied. Then a man near the middle of the room spoke up. Older fellow, maybe mid-60s. I knew him a little. Ran the hardware store for years. "Anybody here remember when that bridge went up?" he asked. The question drifted through the room like dust floating in sunlight. People looked around. A few shrugged. One woman said she'd moved to town in the late 90s. The young man who'd laughed earlier leaned forward on his knees. "Must have been some local job," he said casually. "Probably done quick and cheap." More soft laughter. I felt a warmth rise up the back of my neck. Not anger exactly. Something quieter. Something closer to embarrassment. Funny thing about humiliation. It doesn't always come from being insulted directly. Sometimes it comes from realizing the work of your life has slipped so far into the past that nobody even knows it existed. The councilman at the table cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "if anyone remembers anything about how it was constructed, now might be a good time to share." For a moment nobody moved. The room held still. Outside the wind brushed against the building again, carrying the faint smell of dry grass through a crack in the door. My fingers tightened around the brim of my hat. I could have stayed seated. No one expected an answer from the old man in the back row. Truth is, part of me wanted to stay quiet. Let the meeting finish. Drive home under the long Wyoming sky and keep that memory where it had lived for decades, private, unnoticed, untouched by laughter. But then I thought about the river that year. About the men who had stood knee-deep in that cold water beside me. About the women who brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper while we worked. About the way the whole town had come together because there was no other choice. And before I had fully decided to move, my hands were already pressing against the sides of the chair as I slowly stood up. The metal legs of the seat gave a small scrape against the wooden floor. A few heads turned. I cleared my throat once. The sound echoed more than I expected in that quiet room. For a second I almost sat back down. Then I heard my own voice begin to speak. "Seems to me," I said gently, "I might remember a little something about that bridge." For a second nobody said anything. The room had that particular kind of silence you only notice when it settles after laughter. Not uncomfortable exactly, just uncertain, like folks weren't sure yet whether what I'd said was meant to be a joke. The councilman at the table leaned forward a little. "You do?" he asked. I nodded once and rested both hands on the back of the folding chair in front of me. My knuckles looked older than I remembered them being, spotted, veins rising like narrow blue rivers under the skin. "Yes," Sir, I said. I do. A few people turned in their seats so they could see me better. The young man who'd laughed earlier twisted halfway around, his elbow resting on the back of his chair. I didn't look at him directly. Instead, I glanced around the room. The bulletin board on the side wall still had faded maps pinned to it, county roads marked in red pencil from some long-ago planning meeting. Above that hung a row of old black-and-white photographs. Ranchers standing beside horses. A grain elevator that hadn't existed for 30 years. A parade down Sheridan Avenue sometime back when the town still felt small enough for everyone to recognize every face. The wind outside pushed against the building again. Somewhere down the road a truck engine downshifted and faded away into the distance. I cleared my throat. Well, I said slowly, that bridge went up in the spring of '63. A few eyebrows lifted. That was the year the river flooded harder than anyone had seen in a long while. Snowpack in the mountains melted all at once after a warm spell. Water came down fast. I paused, letting the memory settle into the room. The old crossing didn't stand a chance. Wasn't much more than a narrow timber pass back then. Flood took it clean out overnight. Someone in the front row nodded faintly, like they'd heard their parents mention it once. Problem was, I continued, that crossing was the quickest way for half the ranchers east of town to get cattle to the highway. When it washed out, folks suddenly had a long drive around. A couple of the council members leaned back in their chairs, listening now instead of studying their notes. There wasn't money in the town budget for a proper contractor, I said. Not in those days. I felt the faintest smile tug at the corner of my mouth. So the town did what small towns tend to do when something breaks. I looked down briefly at my hat, still resting against the chair. We fixed it ourselves. The room stayed quiet. I could see people picturing it, though I suspected they imagined something simpler than what it had really been. There were maybe 15 of us that first morning, I said. Met right after sunrise. River was still running high, cold enough to bite through your boots. I lifted one hand slightly, as if I could still feel that water. 2 trucks hauled the timber in from a stand west of town. Not perfect lumber. Just strong, straight beams we cut ourselves. The planner who'd given the presentation shifted a little in his chair. Not dismissive, just adjusting the way he was listening. We didn't have engineering drawings, I said. But we had a couple men who'd built barns their whole lives. One fellow who'd worked railroad bridges down in Colorado when he was younger. I glanced around the room again. And we had a reason to get it done. A faint murmur moved through the chairs. First couple days we mostly hauled and measured. Setting posts down into the bank. Digging footings by hand where the ground was firm enough. I could almost smell the wet soil again. Women from town brought coffee out in big metal thermoses. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Kids ran along the banks carrying nails and tools. My voice slowed without me intending it to. It wasn't fast work. I rested both hands back on the chair. But it was steady. The young man who'd laughed earlier had stopped leaning back. He sat forward now, elbows on his knees. I noticed that without looking straight at him. About the 3rd day, I continued, we had the main beams ready to lift across. That memory came back clear as a photograph. River had dropped just enough we could stand out there without getting swept off our feet. I gave a quiet chuckle. Still cold enough to make your legs ache for hours afterward. A few soft smiles appeared around the room. Took 6 of us guiding those beams into place. Ropes on both ends. One truck pulling slow while the rest of us kept the timber steady. I paused again. You ever hear a heavy beam settle into place just right? I asked. No one answered. It makes a sound, I said quietly. Low and solid. Like something in the world clicking into the position it was always meant to hold. For a moment the room felt smaller. When that first beam dropped into its notch, I said, we all stood there a second without talking. Just listening to the river running under it. I let that picture sit there. Then I went on. Took us 2 weeks altogether. Long days. Sunburn. Splinters in our palms. I flexed my fingers slightly. By the end of it, that bridge stood there simple and strong. Nothing fancy. But it held. The councilman at the table asked quietly, "You were part of that crew?" I nodded. "Yes, sir." I didn't say much more than that. Didn't mention the names of the men who had stood beside me. Some of them gone now. Some buried out on the hillside cemetery where the cottonwoods grow. Didn't explain how proud we'd all been the first time a loaded cattle truck rolled across that span without a creak. Instead I just said, folks used it the very next morning. The planner shifted again, thoughtful now. "And it's been carrying traffic since," he said. "Yes," I replied softly. "Near about 40 years. The room stayed still. No one laughed this time. I could feel the weight of the years in that silence, not heavy exactly, but real. Like the way old wood holds the memory of every season it survived. Finally the councilman folded his hands together. "Well," he said, "I reckon that's quite a story." I shrugged a little. "Just how it happened." He nodded slowly, then looked down the table at the others. "Sounds like the bridge did its job." "Yes, sir," I said. "It did." For a moment nobody spoke again. Then the young man in the middle row, the one who'd laughed earlier, cleared his throat. He turned fully in his chair this time so he could see me. "I didn't realize," he said quietly. I met his eyes for the first time. There wasn't arrogance there now. Just the kind of awkward respect that comes when someone suddenly understands they've been standing on ground they didn't know the history of. "That's all right," I said. "Most folks wouldn't." A few people smiled faintly. The meeting eventually moved on. They still discussed replacement plans, engineering reports, funding proposals. And I didn't object to any of it. Truth is, the bridge probably did need replacing. 40 Wyoming winters take their toll on timber. Progress has its place. When the meeting ended, people gathered their coats and papers. Chairs scraped the floor again. Conversation started in small clusters near the door. The planner came over and shook my hand. "That must have been quite a project," he said. "It was," I replied. The young man who'd laughed gave a small nod as he passed me. "Thank you," he said. Just those 2 words. Then folks drifted out into the evening. I stepped outside last. The wind had cooled the air, and the sky above Cody stretched wide and pale blue as the sun dropped behind the hills. Out along the highway, trucks moved steadily west, their headlights flickering on one by one. For a while I stood there listening to the grass whisper in the wind. I thought about that bridge. About the men who'd built it. About the way time moves forward whether anyone keeps score or not. A week later I drove out to the river just before dusk. Parked the truck and walked across the bridge slowly. The boards creaked under my boots the same way they always had. Halfway across I stopped and rested my hands on the railing. The water moved quietly below, carrying the evening light along its surface. 40 years earlier we'd stood there young and strong, convinced we were building something that might last forever. Turns out nothing does. But that bridge had carried thousands of people safely across that river. Farmers. School buses. New families moving into town. People heading home after long days. All those crossings, all those years, most of them never thinking twice about the hands that had raised those beams. And you know something? That's all right too. Work doesn't need applause to matter. Sometimes the strongest things a person builds are meant to disappear quietly into everyday life. I stood there until the sky turned deep blue and the first stars began to show over the hills. Then I walked back to my truck. As I drove toward town, the bridge settled behind me into the dark, still doing exactly what we'd asked of it all those years ago. Carrying people forward.